democracy is under attack. Healthcare, voting rights, reproductive justice is under attack. Gender equality, fairness are under attack. Criminal justice is under attack. Attention, our democracy is under attack.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anisha Hardy, and I am the Executive Director for Alabama Values. And I want to thank you for joining us this evening for this timely conversation around redistricting and voter suppression happening across the South. This event is made possible by the Democracy Under Attack Initiative and Alabama Values Initiative in partnership with the Southern Leadership for Voter Engagement, also known as SOLVE, and the Groundworks Project. The goal of Democracy Under Attack is to raise awareness around attacks on freedom and democracy and connect these issues to people's front door. It is important to recognize that democracy is not just a passive endeavor. It requires active participation and engagement from all of us. And the first step in protecting democracy is to educate ourselves about the issues at hand. And this means staying informed about current events and being aware of the ways in which our freedoms are being threatened. Now, tonight's discussion will shed light on the recent updates on redistricting and voter suppression in Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Georgia, and unexpected, turns within the fight for voting rights. In recent times, the South has been a focal point for redistricting cases, with numerous challenges surfacing in federal courts. These legal battles have not only highlighted the significance of fair representation, but also underscored the complexities and controversies surrounding the redrawing of electoral maps. Our conversation will be moderated by Sarah Ovaska, the Senior Communications Strategist for SOLVE. She joined SOLVE Coalition in fall of 2023 and works at the forefront of the crucial fight to protect and expand voting rights across the South. Sarah, thank you for joining us and agreeing to moderate this timely discussion.
Thanks, Anisha. I'm glad to be here, and especially glad to be here to talk about these important issues and some of the recent developments we've had with some threats growing against the Voting Rights Act. Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in and showing up tonight. As Anisha was talking about, our democracy's foundation requires that every voice is heard and that no community is marginalized or disenfranchised from participating in our political process. But as we know all too well here in the South, the reality is that we've been faced with a barrage of voter suppression tactics that in particular harm Black voters and voters of color. We've seen that our fight for equitable representation is playing out in the courts, where the whole nation has been watching us as advocates across the South have shown up to fight for our voting rights. Tonight, we're going to dig into the latest updates on these redistricting cases across the South, including a serious threat that's just emerged to the Voting Rights Act, the landmark civil rights law that bars discrimination in our voting and election practices. I'm excited to introduce you to our amazing panel of speakers who each bring their unique insights and experiences in the fight for fair maps across the South. I'm going to first introduce you to Noor Taj, who is a senior counsel for voting rights at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, a colleague of mine. Noor graduated from Temple University in Philadelphia, where she earned her bachelor's and then went on to graduate from Temple University's Beasley School of Law with honors. She went on to clerk for the Honorable William Yon, the United States District Judge for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, and then worked in private practice for 8 years in top-tier firms in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. There, she was able to dedicate a significant part of her time to pro bono civil rights matters, and then she moved to North Carolina in 2019 with the desire to fully commit to social justice issues and joined the Southern Coalition for Social Justice in 2021 to work on voting rights cases across the South. Thanks, Noor. Next, I'm going to introduce you to Charles Mann. And Charles is coming to us from South Carolina. He is the field director for South Carolina Counts, a nonpartisan organization that's focused on engaging and educating South Carolina communities about redistricting and census participation. He's been involved in the fight for fair maps and fair representation in South Carolina, and recently traveled up to Washington, D.C. to speak out when the U.S. Supreme Court heard the racial gerrymandering case, Alexander versus the South Carolina State Conference of the NAACP, just this past October. Next, I'd like to introduce y'all to Kathryn Sadasivan, who is an assistant counsel at the NAACP LDF. Kathryn's work focuses primarily on LDF's voting. She primarily works on LDF's voting work, including congressional, state legislative, and local redistricting. She can speak to various national, state, and local nonpartisan groups on race, voting, and redistricting. And she was counsel in Milligan v. Merrill, which I know many of you in the audience know about, as well as Robinson versus Ardoin, cases challenging the U.S. congressional redistricting maps enacted by the Alabama and Louisiana legislatures following the 2020 census as violations of the Voting Rights Act and other applicable laws. In Milligan, just this past June, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed a lower court's ruling in favor of Black Alabama voters and ordered that the Alabama legislature redraw the state's U.S. congressional map to create 2 districts in which Black voters can elect candidates of their choice. In Robinson, a federal district court and 2 panels of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit found that plaintiffs were likely to succeed on the merits of their claim under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Next, I'm going to introduce y'all to Zephyr Scalzetti. Zephyr is a senior digital organizer at Alabama Values and a force in grassroots organizing with an extensive track record that spans across multiple grassroots organizations in Alabama. Serving as one of the 4 SCSJ CROWD Redistricting Fellows for Alabama, he represented both the Alabama Election Protection Network and the Ordinary People Society. Zephyr is also the host of Alabama Values web series on all things census and redistricting called They Better Get These Lines Right. And next, I'm introducing y'all to Cindy Battles, and Cindy is coming to us from Georgia, where she is the Policy and Engagement Director for the Georgia Coalition for the People's Agenda. She is a community organizer and an advocate with experience in coalition building, volunteer management, project management, human resources, and administration. And she's gifted in verbal and written communication with more than 10 years of experience in various nonprofits. And finally, our last panelist for this evening is Timothy Hughes. Timothy is a native of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and a cum laude graduate of Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. As an activist, advocate, blogger, commentator, columnist, community organizer, educator, human rights advocate, and public intellectual, Timothy works at the intersection of public policy and social justice. And he's actively engaged with several local community-based grassroots coalitions, as well as statewide, regional, national, international organizations, most significantly Civic Tennessee, which is a 501c3 nonprofit civic engagement coalition that envisions a future where underrepresented communities of color, single women, and young people will have greater voices and influence in shaping state policy. So I thank you all for joining us. Those are our great panelists. I'm going to start us off by talking about Alabama. As y'all know, that Alabama has been at the forefront for the fight for fair maps for the last 2 years, as we saw with Milligan. This is no surprise considering Alabama's legacy in championing voting and civil rights, from the pivotal moments in history to the ongoing battles for fairness. And the state remains a constant in guiding our collective efforts. Organizers and advocates' commitment to justice and equitable representation resonates through the challenges that have been faced in Alabama and the hard-won victories in securing fair maps and voting rights. There was a huge win in June with SCOTUS's decision to uphold Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and we eventually got fair maps in October after a fight against the state legislature, who passed remedial maps in July that were worse than the ones that were tossed out by the courts. So I'm going to ask Zephyr, now that Alabama has a new map, Black voters now have a second district to elect the candidate of their choice. Can you give us an update on where we are in Alabama now that we have fair maps and the new congressional district, and remind folks of how we got here?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. So we're really excited in Alabama because we're going to be going into this 2024 election with a brand new congressional map. And the main feature of that map is that for the first time in Alabama's history, we have not one, but two districts where Black voters can elect the candidate of their choice. We got here because a group of Alabamians, specifically Black voters in the state, along with the NAACP-LDF, ACLU, and other parties, sued under the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and they won a major court battle, a battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court, called Allen v. Milligan. And so at this point now, we've already had people qualify to run for that congressional seat, the new Congressional District 2. There are 21 candidates running for that seat, 13 Democrats and 8 Republicans. And now voters are going to have to decide on March 5th who they're going to elect for each party to go into the general election. I would say for those listening, especially people in Alabama, this primary election is incredibly important. You know, this is a new seat. There is no incumbent, and your vote really matters in elections like these, especially in the primary, because in Alabama and across the nation, we tend to focus on November as the day to turn out to vote. But in reality, the primary date is sometimes more important. I would say in Alabama, it's always more important. So this district is, again, it's shaped much differently, and that has its own unique set of challenges because unfortunately, right now, if you live in Alabama and you look up your voter registration, the congressional district it tells you that you live in may not be correct. And that's not because the state's trying to slow walk anything or hide anything. It just takes a lot of time to manually reassign voters. So another major update that's happened is that the Secretary of State, Wes Allen, has gone ahead and purchased GIS services for all the counties in Alabama. This might come as a surprise to some people that they didn't have it to begin with, but in fact, most counties in Alabama do not have their own GIS services. So that's something else that's adding to this, time. So this get out the vote effort is going to be very important. It's very important that we are educating people about what this new map looks like, that they're able to look at it and go, oh, okay, I can see based on this map that I live in Congressional District 2 now, or I don't live in Congressional District 2, and that people know that so that they can be educated voters going into the polls in March. Oh, I can't hear you, Sarah. I think you're still muted.
My apologies. I was saying thanks so much for reminding people that election days do not just happen in November, that our primary season is an important chance to be able to have our voices heard. Now, Zephyr, I know that you're paying attention to what's happening in the South. You're talking to other organizers and you're really in tune with what's going on. Can you dive into some of what we're seeing across the South when it comes to how tactics are being used, both good and bad, to impact the fight for fair maps?
Yeah, so once again, South is at the forefront of new attacks on the Voting Rights Act. Unfortunately, not a surprise. So we're currently experiencing a new wave of attacks on voting power and representation of marginalized communities, especially in the South, although we do see court cases, in North Dakota and in other states that have a history of suppression against marginalized communities in their state. So with Black Alabamians win in Allen v. Milligan, we started this new chapter in the fight for fair maps. After that court case came down, we saw a slew of new lawsuits being filed, and an initial slate of wins. You saw a lot of wins kind of at the district court level. You would see Louisiana and Georgia, I think Tennessee as well, just a lot of southern states getting these first initial decisions saying that these maps are unfair and they need to be redrawn. And of course, with that progress comes, I don't want to say an inevitable backlash, but has come a backlash. So it's an unfortunate reality. We're seeing this resurgence of anti-democratic tactics designed to undermine the Voting Rights Act further, and frankly to prevent a win like Milligan ever happening again. So these initial wins that we saw in states cited Milligan specifically as precedent. And then we see these ways that all of these states are using how Alabama slow walked electing, getting new maps. I kind of brushed over this, but when we looked at when Alabama got the Supreme Court decision and the legislature went back into session to try to pass new fairer maps, they didn't. They didn't pass new fairer maps. They passed a map that was arguably worse than the one that got the decision from the Supreme Court. And then they had to get that, the district court had to intervene and order them to try it again, and then eventually just had to take it over themselves and draw it themselves. And we're seeing that playbook happen across the South, where these southern states are slow walking, they're passing maps that maybe are a slight improvement, but are not actually doing what the court ordered. So when we talk about Georgia, that's something that we've just seen happen in Georgia. In Louisiana, the district court has told them to redraw the maps. The legislature there is still debating whether or not they're even going to go into special session to draw it at all to meet the deadline. And we've seen the amount of time that Alabama got to redraw maps being cited specifically in those court cases as a reason for why these legislatures should have more time to not draw fair maps. And so that's very concerning. But the biggest thing that I'm currently worried about and have been tracking is this Eighth Circuit Court decision about private right of action. So for those of y'all who were like me and maybe a year or two ago you didn't know the difference between the Circuit Court of Appeals or District Court or whatever, the Circuit Court of Appeals is the layer of courts that's right before the Supreme Court. So when a case when a case goes to the Supreme Court, it's something that's happened at the Circuit Court that plaintiffs have or defendants have appealed to the Supreme Court. So in this case, with Alabama, we're talking about our Circuit Court of Appeals. It's the 11th Circuit. When we're talking about Louisiana, that's the 5th Circuit. And it's just divided up geographically. So there's just a set amount of states that they have this circuit court assigned to them. The 11th Circuit covers North Dakota, Arkansas, I believe either Minnesota or Michigan. I'm sorry, y'all. Look, it's Midwest. Look, I'm a Deep South person. I'm sorry. My apologies. But there was a lawsuit in Arkansas citing Milligan as precedents about getting a fairer map. And the 11th Circuit, this was not, as far as I'm aware, this was not an argument brought by the plaintiffs, but the 11th Circuit said, actually, we think that plaintiffs, shouldn't have a private right of action. What the heck does that mean? I think sometimes when we think about lawsuits and we think about private interests, we're like, yeah. No, we don't want private interests being able to sue. But in this case, private interests would be things like the ACLU, like LDF, concerned voters, everything that happened in the Milligan case. And what the 11th Circuit decided was that, or has decided currently for just the 11th Circuit, is that only the DOJ, the Department of Justice, could bring forward lawsuits under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. It's really important to understand that when we talk about this, I usually talk about this in terms of redistricting, but Section 2 is a lot broader than just redistricting. It's about access to voting. So this is also about polling places. This is about a lot of things. And if the Department of Justice would have to bring lawsuits on behalf of every map, that's, when we talk about maps, we talk about congressional seats a lot, but this is something that covers everything from your county commissioners, your local, your city council districts, your school board districts, everything. That is an unbelievable, I can't conceive of how many lawyers the DOJ would have to have that specialize exactly in like Section 2 lawsuits for this to be anything close to workable. It's not. And it's a way to kind of kill Section 2 without overtly killing Section 2. So that's something I'm very worried about. The good news is that currently this is only a decision that affects states that live in the 8th Circuit or are part of the 8th Circuit Court. So that's not something that applies to Louisiana. It's not something that applies to Alabama. It's not something that applies to most of the states that are represented in this call. We've already seen, however, other states, like, for example, Louisiana, trying to take that precedence and use it in a motion to their own circuit court, saying like, hey, this circuit court over here said that actually this lawsuit shouldn't happen at all because there's no private right of action. Can you throw this out? Thankfully, on Friday, so just literally this past Friday, the Fifth Circuit said, absolutely not. We're not doing that. No, they have a private right of action, and they reaffirmed the private right of action. what I'm concerned about is not only that we see this tactic happen in other circuit courts, but now we have a fundamental disagreement between two circuit courts, and that's prime prime ground for the Supreme Court to step in and say, well, as the supreme law of the land, we need to talk about which circuit court decision is correct, and that's worrisome. But I will absolutely defer to the other lawyers on the call to actually get into the intricacies of that. But that's really what I see. Is I see, the same thing we see with legislation, same thing we see with voter suppression in the South, is that Southern states are looking at each other and they're copying and they're taking bits of what they see and they're trying to incorporate it into their own suppression of their own state, their own marginalized communities.
Yeah, thanks for that thorough explanation of what's really a complicated legal case. And this issue of private right to action is one. I've heard the words that it could be devastating and that it's a real concerning threat that I think everyone on this call and is going to be hearing a lot more of this year if we are in fact headed to the U.S. Supreme Court to settle this out, because the Federal Department of Justice doesn't have the resources right now in order to really take these claims to court. And as we know, administrations change and resources can change. So it's definitely something that everyone needs to pay attention. I know we're all paying attention and hoping that everyone out there can just spread the word about this, and also how important the Voting Rights Act is. And one thing that I need to say here is I think that, we talk a lot about the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and that is, that's something Congress could do now if they were in session. That's something that Congress could do to really address and shore up the Voting Rights Act so that we're not constantly having these legal battles where we're seeing voters' rights be undermined across the South and in other states as well. Moving on, Kathryn, we're going to call on you and get an update on Louisiana and Alabama from a legal standpoint. I know that, Kathryn, you were a key litigator in both the Milligan versus Allen case in Alabama and Robinson versus Ardoin in Louisiana. And those are nearly identical cases in terms of the legal issues at play and the voter suppression tactics that were at play. Now, Louisiana lawmakers have until the end of January to draw the maps and pass new congressional maps to replace the maps that a federal judge told them violates the Voting Rights Act because it diluted the power of Black voters in Louisiana. Now, if the legislature doesn't pass a new map by the deadline, then the lower court could hold a trial and decide on a plan for the 2024 elections, according to the higher court's order. So I understand the trial is going to begin February 5th if the legislature fails to pass a new map by the extended deadline, and then the trial will be initiated by the lower district court. Can you talk, Kathryn, about how this might impact the fight for fair maps and equitable representation in Louisiana, and what the consequences are for both the 2024 elections, but also just for Louisiana voters?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for letting me join you all tonight. I'm pumped to be here. Like in Alabama and Louisiana, the Louisiana legislature has always had the ability to pass a VRA compliant map. They didn't need more time. They didn't need to be called into a special session. They had a special session in June of 22. In which they had the opportunity and did consider new maps. They also had their own legislative redistricting session. The legislature and the governor can call themselves into session. And so it really is a delay tactic. They represented to, this higher federal court, this Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, that they needed the time to actually, put forward a new map. Despite all of their, the time that they had before that in the proceedings when the Supreme Court had already said, affirmed a lower court and our Fifth Circuit ruling saying, this likely violates Black people's rights in the state. And they still didn't decide to do anything, not to call themselves into session, not to pass a fair map, not to do anything. And so this is really a delay tactic that I think is effective, and it was effective in Milligan. It's unfortunately kind of the law of the land because state legislatures also have this primary responsibility for redistricting. But in the South, especially with, out the protections of Section 5, where states have always been discriminatory and they're given primary responsibility, you have a real problem because there's no oversight now. And then, that's compounded, that problem is compounded by these arguments about standing of Black plaintiffs and Black plaintiffs' ability and right, indeed, to access the courts to vindicate their rights under these discriminatory maps. So, as Zephyr pointed out, also happened in Alabama. The deadline doesn't really change anything other than the ability of our plaintiffs to show yet again that this map violates the Voting Rights Act, or that the old map violates the Voting Rights Act. We do have reason, though, to be cautiously optimistic, because the Fifth Circuit, several panels of the Fifth Circuit have found that, agreed with our district court judge that the evidence really does show a likely violation of the Voting Rights Act, and that even if it means at trial, we're most of the way there already. And so the Fifth Circuit, the court that we would be appealing to, or that the state would be appealing to, has already kind of agreed with us. The Supreme Court has affirmed those findings. So I think we are on good footing. One thing I did want to, kind of flag in thinking about how to think about the private right of action issue that is coming up in this case and in others, is that it was a panel of the Eighth Circuit. So it was just a small group of the judges there, and that we have reason to believe that, maybe they're a full consideration by all of the judges there, which is possible, and the ACLU actually requested, will yield a different result, particularly because the law in the Eighth Circuit actually has already determined that there is a private right of action. And even if there weren't, there's a private right that you can impute, or plaintiffs could bring these claims under Section 1983. So we don't have reason to be, there's always reason to be pessimistic with the federal courts undermining and kind of narrowing the ways in which a Black plaintiff can get into court, because our institutions have historically operated to discriminate against Black people and to deny them access to justice. And at the same time, I do think that we have more avenues, and we don't need to, kind of overhype folks in the event that, the Eighth Circuit en banc agrees. And, as Zephyr shared earlier, the Fifth Circuit panel in our case decided not to take up the issue of whether there's a Section 2 private right of action. It already decided that there was, that they, that kind of controlling precedent determined that issue, and they weren't going to take it up again. So the whole circuit isn't going to take up the issue. And I think we feel like we're on good standing there. The last thing I wanted to flag as a way of taking back the power when the legislature is delaying and delaying and delaying, is that these are opportunities to testify in front of the legislature and tell them about Black communities of interest, tell them about why it's important to have fair representation, go off on them about the fact that it's been decades and there's only one Black representative in Louisiana or one Black representative in Alabama. And it was only as a result of Black plaintiffs bringing Section 2 litigation. And so this is, I think there are ways to use the state's slow walking against them too, because, I think we just have to understand that they will come up with these tactics, and then ultimately, that has always been the fight of the civil rights movement. But we are, more clever. We can always respond and, pivot in a moment of crisis. And I think that's what we've all been doing together. And it's unfair that we're in that position. And at the same time, I think this is a great opportunity for us to talk back at them about what it is that's important.
Thanks for that, Kathryn. And I think folks listening in this call, it's exactly what they're doing by showing up tonight, and to get educated and to learn more about this so that they can take that information back to their communities. And so we can talk about these tactics and how they are not going to work across the South. Next, we're going to turn to Georgia, get an update from Cindy. Cindy, I know that if the fights in Alabama and Louisiana aren't enough to get you questioning all these tactics, let's talk about what's going on in your state. I know that the Georgia legislature approved gerrymandered congressional and legislative maps after being ordered to draw new districts by a federal judge. And just to catch everyone up, it looks like Georgia legislators were tasked with adding additional Black majority seats in the state's House, Senate, and congressional maps after the existing maps were ruled to have diluted the voting strength of Black voters in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And this ruling stemmed from 3 lawsuits filed by Black voters in Georgia. So while the maps passed, and added additional majority Black districts, the maps passed used extreme gerrymanders that allowed Republicans to maintain their power. And then the Congressional Map passed by the legislature seemingly violated the judge's order and kept the map with 9 Republican seats and 5 Democratic seats. And many voting rights advocates believe that this map defies the court's mandate that lawmakers keep together minority opportunity districts. The Congressional Map dismantled a majority minority district currently being represented by Representative Lucy McBath. I know, Cindy, you spent a lot of time at the state legislature fighting for fair maps and talking about this. And so let me ask you, while the maps technically created additional majority Black districts, how did these extreme gerrymanders impact the state's balance of power? Oh, I think you might be on mute, Cindy. Let's see if we can get you off mute. Oh, Cindy may be having some difficulties being able to have her audio work. Give her a couple more seconds, and if not, we can circle back to you, Cindy, if need be. Okay, looks like Cindy's having some technical difficulties, and she'll hopefully be back with us. So from Georgia, we're going to head a little north now to South Carolina, where we have had quite a year. Charles and Noor, I know that there's a lot going on in South Carolina and that we are currently waiting on a decision really any day now from the U.S. Supreme Court in Alexander versus the South Carolina State Conference of the NAACP. This case was a racial gerrymandering case, and it epitomizes how the state of South Carolina attempted to undermine Black political power in the redistricting process. And I know in that case, both parties asked to hear back from the Supreme Court by January, so it really could be any day now. In this case, the court is reviewing the validity of a federal 3-judge panel's determination that South Carolina's 1st congressional district, which is in the Charleston area, violates the U.S. Constitution's prohibition on racial gerrymandering. The 14th, and this is a case that was brought not under the Voting Rights Act, but it looks at the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, along with prior Supreme Court rulings that prohibits the use of race as the predominant factor in determining the placement of a significant number of voters within or outside an electoral district unless there's a compelling state interest. In South Carolina, the government's argument, their primary argument, was that the state's Republican-controlled legislature, when they redrew the congressional maps after the 2020 census, based their decisions on partisan reasons rather than race. But throughout the oral arguments and in all the briefings as this case wound its way through the courts, the state contended that the legislature's choice to relocate over 30,000 Black voters from Charleston County out of that district was driven by a desire to solidify the district as a more reliable Republican stronghold. Noor, I'm going to ask you first, just in South Carolina and beyond, how do racial and partisan gerrymandering kind of weave in and out and go hand in hand, like what we saw in South Carolina's redistricting efforts?
Thank you, Sarah, and very glad to be here with you all this evening. So basically, given the history of discrimination in this country, and including the present day, race and partisanship are undoubtedly linked and go hand in hand. So of course, then racial and partisan gerrymandering are also going to be linked and go directly hand in hand. Before, legislators were actually pretty brazen about racial gerrymandering and explicitly saying that they were going to gerrymander for racial reasons. And when those maps got knocked down under the 14th Amendment, the line became, well, now we're doing it for partisan reasons. This argument has been around for a long time, but it's gained a lot of traction after the Supreme Court basically said that it will not wade into questions of partisan gerrymandering, that it's not up for the Supreme Court to take that up. And so legislatures in the South have basically taken that as a green light that partisan gerrymandering is A-okay, and that's what we're gonna do. But they want us to believe that it's solely for the purpose of partisan gerrymandering. It just so happens, coincidentally, that the people that are affected in those areas just so happen to be Black voters and happen to be voters of color. Obviously, that's a pretextual explanation for what's going on. And there are, we can show that there are ways that you can accomplish their partisan goals without moving those specific residents in and out of districts. And so there might be ways to demonstrate that the reasons that they're showing are pretextual, but the point is greater than that. Legislators are always aware of racial data. Legislators know where their residents are, and they know where urban centers are, where the suburbs are, and they know where people live. So this idea that we're only looking at partisan data is silly, because we know that the link between the two, and we know where people reside. And so, across the South, there's been this trend during this redistricting cycle of we're doing race blind redistricting, where we're only looking at the partisan data and we're not looking at racial data. But given how linked they are, it's pretty much one and the same. And we've seen it used as a proxy for race over and over again. And basically, South Carolina is arguing to the Supreme Court, you need to separate race from politics. But that's just simply not possible given the history of this country and where we are now.
Great. Thanks for that, Noor. It's like, as you said, it's something that we're seeing in state after state after state across the South and beyond that. Now, so can you talk about how this process of redistricting, where the state lawmakers are focused on delivering essentially for their political party, exactly how it undermines Black political power? And does this steady stream of unfair congressional maps and local voting maps that we're seeing coming out of the South have broader implications for how Black voters and voters of color will be represented in the future and their political influence?
Sure. As they're saying that race and politics are totally separate, you have candidates that are running on anti-immigrant, anti-critical race theory, and anti-DEI, anti-affirmative action, all these racial issues and racial appeals that are being made. And by redistricting in this way and affirming their political power, they are then able to put in place discriminatory policies, both within the voting rights world and outside of the voting rights world. So within the voting rights world, you have like discriminatory voter ID laws that are being put into place. Outside of the voting rights world, you have everything that I've just named, all of these policies where they're trying to basically erase Black history from schools and from education system. And it even goes further than that. It's a little more insidious than that, because it's not just about explicit mentions of race. It's representation is critical for people to advocate for their own communities. And when people don't have representation, they're not getting funding, they're not getting infrastructure, they're not getting medical care. And so it's, undermining Black representation is undermining Black communities and their ability to get what they need. And so it's redistricting seems very specific, but the results that go way beyond the voting arena. It touches every facet of our lives. And one redistricting cycle can put in place rules and policies and laws that affect communities for many, many years.
Thanks, Noor. I appreciate that answer. Now we're going to move on to Charles. And Charles, I know in South Carolina, you have been very much on the ground talking to South Carolinians about this and breaking both this complicated legal case in Alexander versus South Carolina NAACP down, but just talking about the importance of redistricting. Mm-hmm. So Charles, how do you navigate this? How do you navigate the intersection in talking about racial and partisan gerrymandering? And what strategies have you found worked in reaching and mobilizing communities to address these?
Well, first of all, as you know, in South Carolina, you can't have a political discussion without introducing race, okay? And as Nora mentioned, when they talk about the things in South Carolina about Black history, we have Black superintendents who are just being fired, okay, because they support it. So So when they say that it's just partisan, you can't get to the partisan without moving into the racial arena. 30,000 Black voters were moved from Congressional District 1, which is Nancy Mason. She's part of that Freedom Caucus group with Matt Gaetz. And they moved those people to Jim Clyburn's group, district. Now, what they did is they basically split Charleston down the middle, Charleston County. White voters went to District 1, Black voters went to District 6. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. Clyburn's district now runs from Columbia, which is the state capital, to Charleston, South Carolina. That's an hour-and-a-half drive. You can drive from one end of South Carolina to the other in 3 hours, okay? So when you look at that, it's a ludicrous position on the part of our state legislature. By the way, it's a supermajority of Republicans, okay? A supermajority. In redistricting, they basically created districts on a congressional, state, and local level where Republicans, and we have to talk about that name, we have to say that word, okay? We have to say it. They created districts where most of their candidates will win by 60% of the vote. 60%. So now you have a situation in South Carolina where people don't run for office. In the 2022 election, nearly 60% of all statewide races were unopposed. Unopposed. Only Republicans ran. So now, and just back it up as I talk to people, I say now back that up to the primary. Okay, in the primary, only 15% of registered voters in South Carolina showed up. In the Republican primary, those extremists won. When they go to the general with no competition, they win. And they take those extremist views to the legislature and to the Congress. So right now, we're having a great deal of discussion, particularly in my county and across the state, about making sure that we have candidates who are running in the primaries. And by the way, when you have 15% of registered voters participating in a primary and those candidates go on and win, the way that I pitch it is you have 15% of registered voters deciding how 85% of registered voters will be governed in our state. Now, to me, that's just totally backwards. So we're trying to get people to understand that basic premise of getting out to vote, because we do have in South Carolina, the thing that I address a lot is low voter turnout. From time to time, I get asked, are you concerned about restrictive voting laws? I say, my concern is not there. My concern is low voter turnout, because it's the low voter turnout that enables the restrictive voting laws that are being passed in some of our states. So I try to break it down that way. And when you say 15% of the people decide how the remaining 85% will be governed, you see their eyes light up. And they say, oh my God, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because you don't vote.
Thanks for that. I know, well, we've got a big year of voting ahead of us, right? 2024 is here. And so hopefully, we'll be able to use that message and use it in South Carolina and across the South so that we can make sure that 15% of people aren't making the choices for all of us.
Right.
Cindy, looks like you're back, yet it's still an extreme gerrymander. Explain that for those of us who haven't been as tuned in to what's going on in Georgia right now.
So the judge's order was very, very detailed about what the Georgia Assembly could do to rectify the issue. The decision itself was over 500 pages. And what they did instead was introduce maps where instead of actually creating a majority minority district the way that it was supposed to be, they kind of shuffled populations around so that you have the same exact political divide as far as control goes that you did before these new maps, which means there's no way that these majority minority districts are actually getting to choose someone who represents them well, because it's not going to shift the balance of power. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing in this is it's all about power. even more concerning, they did a thing where in 2021, they moved Lucy McBath basically from 6th District to 7th District. And with these new maps, they've changed her district to the point where it is now going to go Republican by 20 points. So it's not just in the failure to enable voters to elect a candidate of their choice. It's after they've elected that candidate, taking that power away. We've seen that not just on a congressional level, but on a state level, where Representative Michelle Au, who was drawn out of her district in the 2021 maps, is now also again combined with several other Democrats, so that she ran as a senator, was moved out of her district, then ran as a representative, won, and has again been moved out of her district. So what you have here is this magic trick of saying, look, we complied with this, we did the thing that you told us to, but not really. And then one of the other things that they did, and I know that we've talked a little bit about this, is this destruction of Gwinnett County, which is one of the most diverse counties in the state of Georgia. It's not technically a majority minority district. What it's called is a coalition district, because there's a large population of Latinx voters, AAPI voters, and Black voters in this county. And instead of being in 3 congressional districts, now they're in 4. So that their voting bloc has been absolutely destroyed, even though the 11th Circuit has already said coalition districts are protected by Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. We heard during this special session repeatedly that they're in fact not. So it's not just a balance of power on a partisan level, because I know that's kind of one of the easiest things that we look at, that it is what they have done to candidates and elected officials of color in these maps. If at all possible, they made it worse than they made it in 2021.
Wow. And that's with a court ruling that we thought was going to be favorable. So tell me, so we've got Alabama not complying with the court order, and Louisiana and legislatures dragging their feet. And I know it's the same in Georgia, where the legislature, basically is just openly defying the court order with these congressional districts. So Cindy, what type of message do you think this sends when we have legislatures in Georgia and across the South that they're not going to pay attention to this? What type of message does this send to voters?
I think it sends a number of messages. First of all, to voters, that their vote absolutely does not count. I appreciate what was said earlier about the fact that 15% of voters are going to choose who actually gets to represent them on a state level or in congressional level, because it's similar in Georgia. We had one competitive district, and now we don't even have that. So it's interesting, because one of the things that we heard a lot during the special session was, we're hoping we can convince these folks to vote Republican. And you're basically telling them they have to vote Republican or their vote doesn't count, that they're going to have to vote against their own interest to say, I elected a person that I wanted to represent me. And the idea that not even in a court of law can voters get any kind of relief, it's astonishing, really. It is a way of saying, regardless of what you think, regardless of how often you turn out to vote, we're gonna put these practices in place. And I think it's probably disheartening. And we really have to get out there and talk to voters and remind them over and over again about why their vote counts and why it is important that they show up. Because, I've got one of I hate to say favorite senators, because that doesn't sound right, but one of the state senators that I think was really good at working across the aisles in his first term. His second term, it was a completely different situation. And I went to him when SB 140, which is a bill that attacks trans kids, was filed, and I'm like, what are you going to do about this? And he's like, I'm going to vote for it. And I'm like, why would you ever? I know this isn't your value. And he was like, it polls at 80% for Republicans, and I won my primary by 32 votes. So we've got a situation where we're seeing these issues, these extreme issues being presented as something that the majority of Georgians support, and they don't. But even people who don't believe in them are going to vote for them to keep power. And then you also have, on the flip side of that, you have Democrats who really don't have to deliver some of the things that we need, because their messaging is vote for us or you get these extreme tactics. And so we're just in a cycle where where power means that the people of Georgia and the people of this country, to be completely honest, aren't being served, because the most extreme fundamental voters are the ones who are going to speak the loudest, because primaries speak the loudest in elections. So.
On that optimistic note, Cindy, you've left us. I mean, I do think it's worth pointing out to folks in the audience, or just mentioning this, like some states have figured this out. Some states have independent redistricting commissions that help with this, and maybe our southern states will be those states someday. Or maybe we'll have federal legislation that makes sure that we have fair redistricting and fair maps, because it's, it's got, everything's catering to the extremes, and that's not where people live, and that's not what people want, and that's not how communities get represented.
Right. You mentioned both the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, and both of those would make a huge impact. So anyone who's listening should definitely be telling their elected official to support that and move it forward.
Right. And passage was awfully close. We got really close to passage a few years ago. And so it's not a done deal. And I think if people speak up and stand up and say that they need this, that maybe we'll see it. So yes. Timothy, we're coming to Tennessee now. Our tour across the South is continuing. And I know it has been a busy and crazy ride in Tennessee over the last few weeks. We saw the Tennessee Supreme Court temporarily block a lower court's decision to force lawmakers to redraw the state's Senate maps. And that meant that the state mostly just won't get new districts for the 2024 elections. In November, a 3-judge panel had ruled that the maps drawn violated the Tennessee state constitution, because that lawmakers incorrectly numbered the seats in Nashville. And in just to let everyone know, in Tennessee, those numbers are important because they determine the years that those seats are on the ballot. And this is the second time the state Supreme Court has ruled to reinstate the districts. In 2022, the same 3-judge panel ruled to temporarily block the map, and the state Supreme Court ruled it was too close to the 2020 election. But here we are we're going into 2024. It's nearly, how many days are we away? 12 days, 13 days away from 2024. Timothy, can you talk about what these setbacks mean for the people of Tennessee? And can you dive into the importance of these numbered districts and what it means for people in Tennessee?
Thank you so much for that question. And thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk about what's happening in Tennessee. There's been so much that's been occurring, both in terms of redistricting and the way in which power is being adjudicated and distributed throughout the state, but also as it relates to a number of the social issues that are kind of in the ether of our conversation and our discussion right now. So many discussions around the importance, for example, of public safety and the need for greater public safety in communities. And so there's a lot of discussion and need for folks to pay attention and to plug in, but also to make sure that we are aware of the many issues that we're facing as community members and as organizations who really want to raise awareness about those important issues. And so as it relates to the decisions that are being made and determinations that are being made around these court cases, it's important, I think, to remember, particularly for those of us who are not attorneys, that a lot of the language that's being used here has been very kind of difficult to engage and very challenging to kind of understand. So there's a lot of discussion around maybe democratizing access to more of the understanding of the language for folks who are not attorneys and who are not legally trained folks. But more than that, just making sure that people are aware that these decisions are occurring, and that a lot of times the decisions that are happening as it relates to the drawing of these maps and these lines aren't just about how the districts are set up, right? They're also about how the power is distributed throughout the state. There was a reference earlier to the ways in which fracking and hacking and the distribution of Black power in various jurisdictions throughout the state have been impacted in some other state jurisdictions. In Davidson County, where I live in Nashville, Tennessee, the congressional district was bifurcated in 3 ways. And so not only is it impossible now for Black voters to be able to elect a candidate of their choice, it's very difficult for us even to be able to work in coalition with others who live in that district, because it's been split in 3 different areas. And often the opportunity districts that are split and that are broken up make it much harder for individuals to be able to select candidates of their choice, no matter what their ideological perspective or racial and ethnic background. So it can get very, very complicated very easily. And so that's why it's really important for us to be able to have an accessible language around how it is that we address this issue. But I'm just going to raise one, I think, important point that I think also needs to be articulated and addressed. When we're talking about the issue of access to power and the way in which elections are critically important for us to be able to access that power, I think it's also important to remember individuals who have been pushed outside of the process, those who have been impacted by the criminal legal system, for example. Here in the state of Tennessee, where Core Civic, which is the largest private prison corporation in the world, is headquartered, we now have nearly 500,000 individuals who have been pushed out of the process and who are no longer eligible to be able to vote. And we're talking some 477,000 individuals, 377,000 of whom have served their sentences and for all practical purposes are eligible to be able to be re-added to the process. More people have been pushed out of the process in the state of Tennessee than actually voted in the last election. And we've got to really consider how that is working as a voter suppression tactic to keep people out of the process, to keep people disengaged. And that's being done very intentionally to make sure that folks are not able to have a voice in the ballot box and are not able to influence the elections on the local, the state, and the national level, which makes it very, very frustrating and discouraging for folks who want to be involved and engaged in the process, but are often pushed to the sidelines and to the margins. And so I just wanted to make sure that I raise that as a concern, because it's something that is happening as a very, very specific project here in Tennessee, and is also happening throughout the region and the country in an effort to try to suppress the voices and the votes of individuals who really otherwise would like to be engaged in the process.
Yeah, thanks for that, Timothy. I think we all were also, you know, when you look at Florida, where voters had gone to the ballot and said, we want people to have we want these returning citizens to have their right to vote restored. And then we saw that sweep of arrests and that chilling effect that we saw on folks that are just looking to stand up and exercise their right to vote. And I appreciate that. I do want to remind everyone in the audience, please drop your questions, your comments in the chat. We've got some leading advocates across the South. We've got some leading attorneys. I know we're throwing a lot at you, but we're here to take your questions and to break it down so you can see how this applies in your state, in your area, and kind of share with us what's on your mind. I do have one more question for you, Timothy. I know we talked about the disenfranchisement of those who have served time. Are there other voter suppression tactics in Tennessee that we should know about, that we should get angered about, and that we should also be looking to see if we're going to be seeing it repeated in other states?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. And I believe also I saw a question that specifically ran to the point of misinformation and disinformation. Particularly around communities of color and marginalized communities where English may not be the first language, or individuals who may be impacted by the criminal legal system, or who may be impacted by other systems, structures, institutions that make it more difficult to access the vote. Misinformation is something that we're seeing really ratchet up in the head up to 2024, particularly for individuals who have not had their voting rights, who may have been impacted by the criminal legal system, but may not have lost the right to vote. There have been billboards and other attempts to try to spread misinformation that suggests that individuals who try to access the vote, who may have been impacted by the criminal legal system, whether or not they have been impacted directly in a way that would limit their access to the voting booth or to the ballot box, discouraging them from engaging in the process or being involved. Also, there have been targeted messaging and other kinds of campaigns to try to suppress the votes of individuals from immigrant communities, saying to them or suggesting to them that if they try to access the process or access the vote, that they might be alerting or triggering some sort of response from law enforcement, which is another tactic that's been used very aggressively in certain communities to try to discourage folks from accessing the process and engaging the vote. And so it's going to be really critical and important for those of us who have credible messengers, who have relationships with organizations and groups who can amplify the voices of those who have been impacted by these various tactics and efforts to try to suppress the vote, to be in communication directly with those community groups and organizations who have relationship. Because we build relationship at the speed of trust. We've got to make sure that we are leaning into those trusted messengers, into those trusted communities, and making sure that we're doing all that we can to educate them both about why it's important to vote in these elections, not just at the presidential level and the federal level, but at every level in the process on the state and local level as well. Because oftentimes, while our voices may be kind of shut out of the process at the top at the federal level, a lot of these decisions that are happening for school boards and for city council and local metro councils, for local judges, a lot of the decisions that are being made on the local level are being decided by a relative handful of voters. We have elections, special elections, and others that are being decided on the local level by a relative handful of votes. And just recently, I'm thinking in 2019, there was a runoff election for Metro Council here in Davidson County that was decided by 25 votes. And so when we're talking about the margins of victory for individuals who will decide what happens in your local context, whether it be with the school board, with the city council, with the local judicial elections and so forth, clerk elections and others, a lot of those decisions where the rubber really meets the road for many of our constituencies and communities are being decided by very, very small numbers of votes. And so while it's important to participate in every election, it's important to participate at every stage and every process in the election, it's really critically important in 24 that we not forget the importance of our local elections.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Sarah, can I add a comment on the misinformation?
Please do. Hop in, Charles.
I was part of a virtual meeting within the past couple of weeks, and it was about AI in the upcoming election. And in that virtual meeting, they had a guy by the name of Gary speak. And they said, when he finished, they said, we have a special guest. We have AI Gary. Okay. And when they brought on AI Gary, and AI Gary looked, talked, and responded like real Gary. So when I watched that, I said, "Oh my God, we can't even trust the trusted messengers anymore because AI is going to generate an AI trusted messenger." So I think that this election we're going to see that. I think some campaigns have already been admonished for using AI, and even Sports Illustrated had AI writers that people didn't know about, and people were reading their material and thinking it was by a real person. So I think this thing that when we look at our trusted messengers, we're going to have to look a little deeper, okay? And I'm a news junkie. I listen and read a lot, and I'm now saying, am I reading and listening to the real person? Okay, so I just wanted to put that in there. So when you see AI Gary out there or AI Charles out there, you know, it's possible.
It is. And I want to assure everyone that everyone here tonight on this panel is we're our real selves. We're showing up. No AI here, but I agree, Charles, and we're hearing a lot about the role of AI in political elections and what this means and what it's going to look like in 2024. And I know there's a lot of groups working on it, but it's a bit mind-boggling. Absolutely. Well, I'm going to turn. So now we're at the questions portion of the talk. And this is where we really want to hear from folks. Like, what's on your mind? What are you wondering about? I'm going to start first off, with some of the questions we have. We're going to start out. I know when Zephyr was talking to us and he talked about the pushback from those who want to maintain power, and it can be awfully discouraging. And I think in all of our states and the rest of the southern states that aren't here represented, but are still represented by, we know that's the same struggles. So my question is for organizers, when you're engaging with communities to maintain momentum and support for fair maps, how are you doing that in the face of this resistance? And what role are you seeing that community involvement plays in overcoming some of these challenges? Cindy?
Well,
y'all jump.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
Nope, y'all jump in. You got it, Zephyr.
Okay, yeah, I was going to go first, but please, by all means, other people jump in, because I know I laid out a lot of negatives, but I think a good thing that I think every Southern organizer knows is that we've never had a battle that comes easy. We've never had a victory that comes easy. Organizing in tough situations where you don't really see a victory possible is kind of like what we do. So you can really kind of sub in any fight that we've had in the South for redistricting, and the answer kind of is the same about how you engage with communities and how you maintain momentum. The more community you can bring together around something, the more that people can support each other, the more that you remind each other why you're staying in the fight. And like what Kathryn brought up earlier about using the opportunities of legislators redrawing these maps out, to use it as a opportunity to go in and tell them over and over and over again, like, this is what you should be doing, and getting yourself on the record. I think ultimately just reminding each other, reminding community that ultimately the power comes from the people, right? Their authority, they try to gerrymander and they try to change things so that they can stay in power, but ultimately power is derived from the people. And that's really what you kind of have to remember. And I will say, as somebody who was not hopeful at the beginning of Allen v. Milligan, I know everybody now is like, I knew we were going to win. I was pessimistic. I was very pessimistic. I was not happy about, going forward with that, because I thought we were going to lose the VRA, and I was wrong. And I'm very, very glad that I was wrong. Very glad. So I just want everybody to know, when I'm being pessimistic, it's more that, like, I like to hit the red button and be like, hey, this is dangerous, but you still put your nose to the grindstone. You act like you're going to win. No matter how long it takes, no matter what you have to do, pace yourselves, but act like you're going to win. And I think, just the last point I'll make is that every time that I'm almost grateful that Alabama slow walked things a little bit. And I know that seems odd to say, but what I saw in North Carolina, Timothy and I, we were both CROWD Fellows. And when we started as CROWD Fellows, the North Carolina Fellows were like, they were so far ahead. People knew what redistricting was. And I remember sitting there going, like, this is the first statewide effort we've ever had in Alabama, period. Like, we don't know where a lot of these maps are. I'm still, to this day, Timothy, you remember that spreadsheet they gave us the first week? Still filling it out. Still, 2 years later, I'm still working on it. And that's how far it is. But by doing this, by bringing redistricting up and having the legislators bring it, slow walk this, right? It got it into news articles. We've been able to message about it. We've now been talking to the same communities for years, and so I'm going to take this situation that was, they never should have denied Black voters the right to elect candidates of their choice in 22, but I'm going to make lemonade out of lemons, and I'm going to use that as a chance to be like, okay, but now we don't have this drop off, right? We don't have this drop off between 2020 and 2030 because we've just been going straight the whole time, and that's kind of how I've been looking at this, as we're building a brick wall, brick by brick, and that's just kind of how I've been rolling with it. But by all means, I'd love to hear how other states are handling this, because I will take anything.
I want to bounce off a point, because I think we were all shocked about Milligan, right? But I also think we need to remember that we are dealing with a Chief Justice who very much cares about the reputation of his court, and this idea that it's fairly balanced, even though, like, evidence suggests it's not. So one of the the things that have been speculated, like quite often, is one of the reasons Milligan went the way it did was because it was an opportunity to kind of show that the Supreme Court was balanced and that it cared about like precedent and that kind of thing. And I think one of the reasons it did that was because Alabama Values and the Power on the Line Coalition and folks across multiple states, including Georgia and the People's Agenda, we were holding events on a state level and in DC the day that Milligan was held, that Milligan was heard. And so it really showed the justices on the Supreme Court, people are paying attention to this. And I think that is very true on a state and federal level. When politicians start seeing that people are paying attention and that they're going to hold them accountable for the way that they hold power, even by ignoring voters and voters' wishes, like that's going to change things. This is actually the second redistricting cycle that I've been a part of, and I've been a part of trying to get redistricting commissions in the state of Georgia for well before this last session. And when I first started this, people didn't know. People did not understand the impact of redistricting. They didn't understand what kitchen table values were impacted by that. And I'm really fortunate in working for an organization that was started by Dr. Joseph Lowery. And he was around, like we started in 1998. Right? Like he started this well before. God loves Stacey Abrams, and I really do. But Dr. Joseph Lowery was a leader in the traditional civil rights movement, and we were knocking doors and talking to voters well before 2017, 2018. So we have had those conversations. We have connected that with people, and they started paying attention. So that is one of the reasons why you see increased voter turnout. That's why you see that when the public portal opens, there are 800 people demanding fair maps. And did they get it? No, but they know they didn't get it, and they're going to demand a change. And I think that's where we need to remember where organizing works, because even on a bipartisan level, people don't want to be told that they're being disempowered or that their voice doesn't count. And I think that's the message that we send to voters in Georgia and across the southern states is we speak up. We don't just show up and vote, because that's only that is one of the smallest things that moves things forward. We hold our elected officials accountable. We send them emails, we call, we show up when we can. We have rallies, we show up at their district offices, those sort of things. So you remember, like, we're paying attention. And when you deliberately, instead of doing things that the folks that voted for you have asked you to do, whether it's an opportunity weight to a QBE that hasn't been updated since Reagan was president, or making sure hospitals aren't closing, or making sure our kids get a good quality education without turning it into some sort of ridiculous fight against CRT or DEI or whatever you want to call it, banning books. Those are not the things that the voters have asked you to do. And if you don't start doing those things, you're going to get voted out of office. So however you decided to hold on to power is going to be irrelevant, because we're paying attention and we do have power.
Thanks for that, Cindy. Yes, I agree with Milligan and these other cases, as well as just letting the powers that be know that we're watching and we're paying attention, and that it is supposed to be, and it is a government that is by, of, and for the people, and we will make it so. Is there any? So I'm going to move on with our questions again. Folks, drop it in the comment chat, and we were happy to take whatever questions come up. Next question coming up. So we don't just have elections next year, we also have legislative sessions that I think, as Cindy knows, as Timothy knows, as y'all know, that we're also going to see state legislatures have legislative sessions a lot happening in the winter and spring. And then this is both for the lawyers as well as the organizers. Are you hearing about any new or maybe new voter suppression tactics that you're keeping an eye out for, things we should be watching for in 2024?
I can just give like a few that we have, some thoughts on. In Alabama, of course, there's a bill that may be criminalizing absentee voting that we're pretty concerned about. That's like a big one. And of course, in Louisiana, we have our upcoming special redistricting session in January, most likely, plus a new legislature taking office where, historically, Louisiana, at least recently in the last few decades, has had a Democratic governor. And now we are switching to Jeff Landry, who is the Attorney General, and a very aggressive one, very antithetical to the Black people of Louisiana. So we're very concerned about the bills that the Louisiana legislature will be pushing forward. And then in Alabama, we've already seen the criminalization of absentee voting as just like another method of cracking down on the very limited opportunities to vote in Alabama.
Yeah, in Georgia, we still have we're what's called a biannual. So any of the bills that were introduced last legislative session are still alive this legislative session. And we do know that Chairman Burns still has his omnibus bill that the Secretary of State actually came down at 8 o'clock at night to the Capitol. His elections director came down and was like, this violates federal law. And they still voted it out of committee. Yeah, it's fun down here in Georgia. It makes it harder for a significant number of people to vote. It makes election administrators' jobs harder. And one of the things that we continue doing in Georgia is funding or passing unfunded mandates. And counties are responsible for paying for these elections with these unfunded mandates. And then SB 202 made it harder or impossible for them to get funding from outside sources like grants and that kind of thing. So one of the things that does is it means that a significant portion of municipalities in the state of Georgia rely on fines and fees to fund their budgets. So one of the things, and I really appreciated when we were talking about justice impacted people and the way that they have been disenfranchised from voting, but that's another thing that we have to look at is when they're passing these unfunded mandates, what else is it impacting? It's impacting our criminal justice reform efforts. It's impacting the services that counties can provide to people and that kind of thing. So those are some of the things that we're looking at in Georgia. Anything that makes it harder for election administration to do their job, anything that makes it harder to vote. I know AI and some internal threat sort of things were mentioned. We've got draft legislation for both of those. And then, of course, anything that makes these voter challenges easier to file, because that's another way that, at least in Georgia, that these massive voter challenges, it not only doesn't make counties' jobs harder, but it's disenfranchising folks. And in a state where the partisan defendant appears because of gerrymandering, the number of folks that are getting disenfranchised by these voter challenges could really make the difference in elections on a municipal, state, and federal level. So LD1 for us is January 8th. So everybody send good vibes Georgia's way, please.
In South Carolina, 2 years ago, we had over 40 voter bills introduced into the state legislature. Luckily, a lot of them didn't see the light of day. And what I'm now seeing is the effort for the state elections commission to have more jurisdiction over local election boards, meaning they can overturn, they can intervene, and that sort of thing. And so what I'm telling people a lot in my community is we're going to pay attention to the state level, but we also want you to start going to the local voter election board meetings, because what we're seeing is consolidation of polling places, discontinuing long-term polling places, early voting, where we finally got 2 weeks in South Carolina, that we're now seeing that instead of having 5 or 6, they're now coming back to maybe 1, okay, which is what it was during the old days. So what we're saying is go to the local elections board and pay attention to what they are doing to local access to the polls. And we need improved signage. We need better ADA and disability access. We need more poll workers. And I am very concerned in our state that we're not going to have enough poll workers. So, which means they're going to have to shut down polling places. And I'm concerned those polling places may be in my community. So we have to be there. And I'll just give one last point. I attended one of those. I attend them regularly in my county. And at one meeting, a guy came in and said, we need more local security at our polling places. We want people to do an additional signing when they walk in the door. Okay. And I looked at him and I looked at the members of the boards of commission. I said, that's voter suppression. I said, why are you trying to put more security in place, which is not required or being justified? It's voter suppression. And all the commissioners looked at each other and said, let's move on. If I had not been there to raise that question, is there a possibility they would have had added security at the local polling places? I think there's a good possibility. So we need to show up there as well as being focused on what's happening in the state legislature.
So I made a point of posting in the chat that this really is about, the struggle between the localities and municipalities in the state. Here in Tennessee, as it seems to be in many of the other states here in our region, there are lots of efforts to try to use state preemption as a tool to overturn the local will of the people. We see it in the efforts by the state to try to take over our airport authority and our local school board jurisdictions, and to make decisions about what local communities want in terms of public safety and oversight of law enforcement. So there's been a number of efforts by the state legislature to try to do everything that they can to subvert the will of the people, and the efforts that are being made on the local level to encourage folks to be plugged in around civic engagement. And in addition to that, of course, there are also these long-term and continuing fights around banning books and other social issues, attempting to take away bodily autonomy and to subvert the will of many Tennesseans to have greater access to health care. An expansion of Medicaid, refusal to do that. And then, of course, the continuing fights that are attempting to try to criminalize personal decisions and private decisions for individuals, particularly around issues related to the LGBTQIA community. And so there are a number of fronts where we're fighting to make sure that we're protecting the rights of all of our community members and making sure that the voices of those who have been marginalized and are attempting to be silenced are amplified and uplifted. And that continues with the fight around the ways in which these lines are drawn in terms of redistricting, but also about the way that the power is adjudicated at every level, be it in the boards and commissions and the decisions that are happening on the local level, the state legislative decisions and priorities, the transparency around how it is that politicians and individuals who are seeking to be representative of the community are being financed. There's a lot of conversation around educational equity and conversation around the ways in which charter schools and other forms of educational programming are being laid out in the state, and efforts to try to make sure that folks can choose how it is that their children have the best access to a public education and how those dollars are allocated as well. So there are ongoing struggles and fights, but we're standing united in solidarity with our folks and in communities throughout the country, and particularly here in the South, because so much of what we have been fighting for many generations here in the South, if we were not being effective in our messaging, if we were not being effective in our outreach and in our organizing, our opposition would not be organizing so aggressively against us. And so we should see this not just as a chance or a challenge that we're facing generationally to try to move the baton a little bit further along for this generation of Southerners and for folks in our communities and in the places where we're organizing. But we should also see it as a badge of honor that we're winning, because so much is being done, and so many of the forces that are trying to organize against us are pushing so aggressively against us because they see that we're winning. We've got to make sure that we're very effective in how we do the educational outreach for our community so that folks are informed and can push back against misinformation and efforts to try to stop the progress that we're making. And then also we've got to make sure that we are training folks to move in, not just from an organizing standpoint, but also to run for office and to seek office, to make sure that they can serve in those positions of power and influence and help to make the decisions that can really move the agenda forward. Because as we're doing the organizing on the outside, we've got to make sure that we have allies and advocates on the inside who can work with us and who are willing to hear our voices when we raise them. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share, Elaine.
Great. Thanks for that. And thanks for all those answers. We're at the point of the evening where we're going to take our final question. It's been a really powerful evening hearing from you all and sharing your experiences. So for my last question, I want to make sure that we speak again, much in the path we've been doing, but to the light in the tunnel and at the end of the tunnel. I mentioned in the beginning that our conversation that's important to stay informed and to stay informed around the attacks on our freedom and democracy. But it's also important for us to explore ways to counter these attacks and to be part of the fight and the solution. So here's my question for our panelists, and I'm going to ask you all to take a minute response. In what ways are you, your organization, and partners fighting for freedom and democracy? And how can people get involved in being part of the movement for change? And Noor, I'm going to start with you at SCSJ.
Sure. So, SCSJ is involved in Solve and CROWD, and it's really about everything that we've discussed today about spreading correct information and getting people to understand redistricting. Redistricting can be hyper technical, but in reality, it's a very basic concept, and it goes back to basic democratic principles. And it's about getting people, whatever you're interested in. If you're interested in infrastructure, healthcare, Medicare, it all comes back to, does your vote count? And so we just have to kind of make that, make that bridge for people to understand how fundamental it is. I will say, lawyers, we are of limited utility in the sense that we come in when the problem has already occurred. We will sue. When we sue, that means the problem has already occurred. So I find my job is to support the organizers. How do we help you to stop the problem before it ever occurs? And yes, we are there to be a backstop. And yes, we are there to sue if and bring litigation if things go wrong. And we're here to explain the law. It's been mentioned before that we really need to do a better job at explaining the law, and that's something that we really work very hard at SCSJ with programs like this to really get the word out and to make it more palatable for people. And so our job at SCSJ is to really support the organizers and to ensure that people understand that their right to vote is fundamental. And as Tim just said, I mean, if it wasn't so important, they wouldn't be fighting against your right to vote. And so, I think, that's our role at SCSJ, and my role as an attorney is really to support the organizers.
Thanks, Noor. Crowd, on to you. How can people get involved in change in and around South Carolina where you are?
One of the things that we found out right after doing a debrief on redistricting is that we found out most of the people that in our community did not understand basic civics. They didn't understand why the census was important. They didn't understand how that related to redistricting. They didn't understand how that relates to voting. And the one thing that we've touched on here, how that relates to federal allocation of dollars in their communities. So one of the things that we're going to do is go out and to community groups, to home settings, and talk to people about this is why it's important that everything comes back to voting. Everything that you complain about goes back to voting, and why, and that voting is who gets elected to create public policy that impacts your life from the moment you wake up in the morning. and you turn on your faucet. So you have to get engaged. And as Nora just said, if your vote didn't count, why are they working so hard to keep you from doing it? And we're just trying to get at a very core level and just plain speak to people. Just plain speak to them. You have to do this. And as an old head on this call, guys, I look at the people here. I'm older than most of you all. I know what Jim Crow looked like. I know what it looked like when I didn't have freedoms. I know what it looked like to walk to the back of the bus. I knew what it looked like to go to the colored counter and the colored water fountain. I don't want to get even close to that again. But if we don't engage, our freedoms are incrementally being taken away. And before we know it, because we are not engaging, we could be in some environment like that. And people will go, when and how did that happen? It happened because we weren't paying attention. So we want to get people to pay attention at a very core level.
Thanks for that, Charles. Kathryn, what about you?
Yeah, so at LDF, I think we have brought a multi-strategy approach to advocacy across the South. And I think that has been a transformative mission in the sense that we've always kind of had this belief in the ability to transform American institutions, recognizing that they are, fundamentally racist. And I think it has been a privilege to work at LDF because with, kind of the benefit of what we bring to bear, I think we've been really successful in winning these challenges. And I think that's also the benefit of an approach to a problem that includes all the skill sets and all the tools that we have in our toolbox as lawyers. We knew we could win a Section 2 case in Alabama, like it had already been done in 2019. But the reason we went to the Supreme Court isn't because we were good lawyers. It's because there was a campaign of people in every single state that held every single level of government accountable and signaled that we are all watching, we're all in it together, and we have built it like we're tying our destinies together. We're all in this, to support Milligan. We want something better. We're going to dream of better, and damn it, we're going to demand it too. And, we're all here together. And so I think that in thinking about, our next steps, we'll keep playing the chess game in the court. And, so we have a wonderful plaintiffs as in Alabama and Louisiana who are, Power Coalition for Equity and Justice, who are literally, spend every day like getting out the vote all across Louisiana, the state conference of the NAACP all across Louisiana. And they respond to all of these issues. They've testified at every single legislative hearing. They will testify before the legislature again. They will testify at trial again. And so, I think when we all come to the table and we all bring our skills to bear in service of a shared mission that represents, something that we could all believe in, which I think dignity and worth and equal worth of all people, but particularly Black people in the United States and Black people in the South, is something that I think a lot of us, including from other minority groups and other people of color, can really relate to and support. And, I think building that, multi-generational, background coalition allows us all to fight and to be successful in ways that I think we've really benefited from and can see the actual results in Milligan and hopefully in Robinson too.
Yes, thanks for that, Kathryn. We'll all be watching in Louisiana to see what happens. Cindy, tell us about Georgia. What ways are you, your organization, and partners fighting for freedom and democracy?
So at the People's Agenda, we know that the best way to protect democracy is with an informed and a resourced electorate. So we've got a number of different ways that we do that. We have a voter registration program where we, not just in the big elections, but municipal elections, 24/7, 365, right? We have a voting in jail program where folks who have been charged with misdemeanors or even folks who haven't been convicted yet can register to vote. We make sure that they're able to vote absentee, that kind of thing. We have our voter education program where we use social media, text banks, but also on the ground events, knocking on doors, having town halls, that kind of thing. Someone mentioned election board monitoring, and we have a democracy squad where volunteers go to election board meetings and take notes and alert us if something's happening. So I don't know if anybody remembers a few years ago, Lincoln County was going to close all of their polling locations with the exception of one. And we were able to stop that because someone went to the election board meeting, heard that plan, and we mobilized a petition drive where we spent weeks gathering signatures of folks in those impacted precincts, and we stopped those polling locations from being closed. We have the largest election protection program in the state with our coalition partners, where volunteers spread out over 95 counties, making sure that access to the ballot is protected, voters' questions are answered. We've got a hotline to make sure that if folks need help, that they can get help. We have a rides to the polls program, so that if you can't get to the polls to vote, we'll get you there. So if you want to get involved in any of these things, I would encourage you to go to our website, thepeoplesagenda.org. We've got a volunteer form. You will hear from me, and we will get you plugged in where you are best able to use your passions and your abilities to protect democracy and access to the ballot.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Cindy. Timothy, on to you. Tell us, how can people get involved in Tennessee in being part of the movement for change?
Thank you so much. And so it's always a challenge to follow some of the amazing and incredible voices that are on this panel, and especially Cindy, when you were breaking down all the amazing and incredible things that are happening in Georgia. I just want to give a special appreciation both for you, Sarah, and the folks who have made it possible for us to have this conversation about our democracy being under attack and the things that we can do to fight back. And also to Mattia Powell, who's the executive director for Civic TN, for allowing me the opportunity to be a part of this conversation and to be on this platform tonight. Civic TN has been doing amazing and incredible work in the state of Tennessee, not just to talk about the ways in which our democracy is under attack, but the ways that we can stand together as coalition members, as community members, as organizers to fight back against those attacks on our democracy. We see the examples over and over again of groups like the Tennessee Three, who stood in the well of the Capitol, literally demanding that we do something about public safety and that we address finally at long last the issue of gun violence in our communities. We can continue to do all that is necessary to make sure that the voices of those who have been historically marginalized and pushed out of this process are amplified in these moments. This is a time, an inflection point, where we really have the eyes of the world upon us here in Tennessee, here in the South, to really be able to address the needs and the concerns of our communities and our constituencies. And what we should do is stand together in lockstep with one another, supporting the efforts that are being made to try to raise our voices and make sure that we're doing everything that we can to demand what is right for our communities and our people. To paraphrase or to borrow a phrase from Ashada Shakur, it is our duty to fight, and it is our duty to win. We can love and support one another because we have nothing to lose but our chains. So thank you so much for the opportunity to uplift the amazing work that we're doing and to continue the fight forward.
Great. Thanks so much. Zephyr, you're going to close us out. Tell us what we can do, what people can do to get involved in being a part of the movement for change.
Also, I work for Alabama Values, which helped host this and the Democracy Under Attack platform and campaign to bring attention to this. So by joining tonight or by watching this video, you've already taken the first step. But I would encourage you, heavily encourage you to tap in with us, follow us on social media. We're on there a lot. We're posting a lot of good stuff. Season 3 of They Better Get These Lines Right is going to be coming out very soon. That's going to kick off with this next year. And because we're talking about this ongoing fight for maps in Alabama, and you might think, like, well, Zephyr, you just said the congressional map was done. Yes, but local redistricting is actually going to majorly take place in 2025, which is very odd, right, for Alabama. But I'm telling y'all now, if you're in Alabama, your town or county or city is likely going to redistrict in 2025. I would encourage everybody, just do one simple thing. This is a great way to see how open your local municipality is try to find your map. like of your city council. Try to figure out what district you live in. See how hard or how simple your town has made that for you. If you can't find it online, pick up the phone or email and email the city hall and ask them where you can find it. Do they know what you're talking about? Can they tell you whether they're at large or if they have districts? Do they tell you that you have to come in person and take a picture on your phone of a map on the wall? Is there a copy that they can email you? If you tell them your address, will they tell you what district you're in? How easy is it to figure out who actually represents you other than being told by like word of mouth, like, oh, this is your district? And that will tell you a lot about how open or not your local, your community is. And if you do get a copy of that map, please send it to us because I am still working on that master list of our things. So the way you can find us on social media and get that information to me is at AlaValues. That's our handle on all of our social media, including YouTube, where hopefully you are watching this. I want to say thank you to everybody who showed up. And the very last thing I'll say is that Noor opened by saying, that lawyers kind of come in afterwards, but you also come in at the top as well, because both Timothy and I mean, I've been on a call with most of y'all for 3 years now. I know when we started, this all started because not this as an Alabama Values, but my journey with redistricting and being a redistricting fellow started because of a CROWD Academy, which was before we even became fellows, right? That was put on with a not insignificant amount of help from legal experts, from people who were trying to make this accessible to the general public. It comes from funding programs like Solve, funding micro grants and things that get distributed, having a really holistic approach to this. I like to tell people that if we talked about redistricting, if we talked about voting the way that we talk about redistricting, we'd be showing up to people's doorsteps and we'd be asking them to vote and having to explain the concept of a ballot, the concept of districts, the fact that you're voting for somebody who's going to stand in and vote for you. How do you go to a polling place? Those are all topics that we spend a lot of time and energy and effort breaking down for people, explaining to people. Redistricting, which is I would say the same level of complicated, maybe even a little bit simpler. We have started, I think, as a grassroots energy behind explaining that, getting people involved, making it more accessible. But I'm really appreciative of everybody who's on here, of all of the work that you've all done. And that I get to be around, a lot of the same people over time, and that this has become an ongoing thing. I know when Timothy and I started, it felt like I remember hoping that I would be around in 10 years so that I could pass off my work to like the next person in Alabama. And now I know I'm going to be around, and that's not an insignificant thing, that there is, that there is funding in that there is an opportunity to do that. That's huge, especially when you're in the Deep South in areas that do not usually get invested in. So I will close with that note of gratitude.
Well, thanks for that. And I hope we have you for a long, long time in the fight, Zephyr. We need you and everyone else on this call and everyone listening as well. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening for the last Democracy Under Attack briefing of 2023. Again, this initiative was made possible through a collaboration under Alabama Values, Solve, and Groundworks Project. Remember to stay connected, informed, and engaged in the fight. You can start by tapping in with the organizations highlighted here this evening. You can follow Alabama Values on social media at AlaValues and consider becoming a member of the Solve Network. That's where I am. Happy to work with grassroots partners about how to talk about voting rights and redistricting. Reach us at Solve Network Official, and the Groundworks Project can be reached at Groundwork Proj, Proj. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a lovely evening, and thank you for spending time with us tonight to talk about these important issues.
Attention! Our democracy is under attack.